I'm 94 years old. Years ago, I made a decision that still wakes me at night. I pulled an enemy boy out of the snow and hid him in my foxhole. Stay with me. I'll tell you what happened that morning. When I close my eyes now, the Ardennes comes back like a film reel. Gray sky that never seemed bright, the bitter sting of frozen breath, the brittle snap of pine branches underfoot. December 1944. The trees were a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was waiting, like the moment before a strike. We moved in small groups, eyes peeled for movement, for any sound that could mean trouble. Tanks idled at intervals, black shapes with their engines ticking as they cooled, their tracks leaving deep furrows in the hard ground. There was the ever-present smell of diesel and oil, the sharp chemical tang of benzene that clung to clothing and teeth. You could taste it when you breathed. We were on the edge of something that felt bigger than any of us. We heard the radio chatter, the maps passed down the column, the gruff voices of men trying to make sense of orders in the fog. There were stories about supply convoys being ambushed, about trucks stalled in icy ruts. We all knew that in a mechanized war, the thing that keeps you moving is not courage, but fuel. You could have the bravest crew and the best tactics, but if your tanks and trucks ran dry, you were just metal and grief. We came upon the place by accident, or maybe by the strange luck that follows men who are tired and see what they wish to see. From the road it looked like a jumble of metal and canvas, several trucks half buried in snow, a line of helmets on a fence, and beyond them a heap of jerry cans stacked like a small, chaotic fortress. The cans were everywhere, some dented, some bright, some stained dark where they'd leaked. There were crates too, and tarps tossed aside. Men were already rummaging through, pressing their hands against the cold metal like it might warm them. It hit everyone at once, the sight of so much fuel. We had been living on a ration of hope, rations of coffee, cigarettes, a cookie now and again. We had watched tanks creep along with gauges that read empty, had seen crews curse and push. To find fuel lying out in the open, it was as if someone had left a banquet for the dead. Our sergeant, the kind of man who always kept his voice low, walked among the stacks and read the stamped labels, scrunched up his face and shook his head. You could hear the wonder in the quiet. Some men began passing jerry cans hand to hand, stacking them in a neat row as if arranging trophies. I remember a private picking up a roll of newspapers, his hands trembling, and reading a headline aloud in a small voice. It seemed obscene. News from home, coffee and petrol, all wrapped together, the trappings of a life that still existed somewhere else. Then came the other feeling, a cold, climbing shame. War is not tidy.
For every supply pile we found, there were stories of others burned or dumped to deny them to the enemy. There were nights when commanders ordered tanks and trucks left to rot because they couldn't be fed. That knowledge was like frost on the insides of your ribs. You could feel the arithmetic of it. Factories in the U.S. pouring out fuel, rubber, ammunition. Supply lines stretched thin and then stretched thinner as the front moved. On the other side, shortages that turned men into scavengers. Someone, an NCO I think, said what everyone was thinking. This will change things if they get it. He was talking about fuel falling into the wrong hands, about how a dump like this could keep an advance rolling. But even as he spoke, there was talk of orders from higher up to deny supplies rather than let them be used by the enemy. Plans had been made before we ever arrived, plans that put a math problem above a human fact. Burn this, blow that, leave nothing that could tip scales. It was a kind of grim arithmetic that moved behind everything we did. We were no strangers to destruction. In other sectors, men had burned supplies to keep them from being taken. Convoys that couldn't be protected were pushed into ditches and set alight. There were reports of whole dumps being torched, mountains of fuel and materiel turned into orange, choking plumes that night swallowed like a lesson. I had seen trucks abandoned at the roadside with a twist of flame low in their belly, hissing as whatever fuel remained gave up its heat. The logic was cold and unsentimental. Deny the enemy, no mercy for the scrap of humanity that clung to a buckled can. On that morning, with the wind scraping the wood off the trees, we approached the makeshift depot. The men who had already been there had begun to label and parcel things out,
ammunition into a separate pile, spare parts into another, and the jerry cans into rows. There was a sort of economy to it, the way men reduce chaos into small gestures of order. I knelt to pick one up, felt the weight in my gloved hand, and thought of how many miles of road that one little can could give a tank. I'll never forget the look on the face of the man who set the cans down beside me. Not joy, not greed, but a sort of stunned disbelief at abundance. We weren't given long to admire it. Word came through the cracked radio that follows of retreat had become thicker, that German patrols were moving faster than expected. There were orders to check the area, and also, quietly, to prepare for denial if necessary. You learn quickly what orders sound like in war. Some are barked and some are whispered into a notebook with a pencil that keeps its point. Deny the enemy, destroy what's necessary. It was then that I saw him. He was small, hunched against the drift beside a demolished truck, his uniform a muddled patchwork of 2 large boots and a greatcoat that had seen better winters.
He wasn't the hulking German we had been briefed about. No stern officer or lined veteran with a cigarette hanging from his lip. He was young, in a way that made my throat ache. He looked like a boy who had been pulled into a world too large for him. His breath came in quick little clouds, his fingers were red and raw at the tips, and his face had that look of someone caught when the story ended and the aftermath had begun. He had a wound, a shallow cut across his temple, crusted with blood and frost. He held his arm protectively across his chest, as if protecting more than flesh. When he saw us, his eyes were at once afraid and surprised, like a child who has been found hiding from a game. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't shout. He only stared, and in that stare there was the terrible, clear arithmetic of 2 lives crossing paths. One man protecting a can of fuel he might never see used, and one young soldier who had been reduced to the basic need of not dying. I remember thinking then that the war had become very small and very bright at the same time. There was the roar of distant engines, the crackle of men sorting supplies, a half-second of wind that caught the edges of flapping tarpaulin and made a sound like paper tearing. The rest of the world shrunk to the boy's face. "Don't move," our lieutenant said, hand on his pistol, but his voice was hushed. He didn't look like a man giving a command so much as someone trying to keep a brittle thing from cracking. The kid lifted his hands a fraction, palms out, showing surrender. He mouthed something in a language I didn't know, or maybe in German that I couldn't catch. There was mud under his nails and a bruise forming around his eye. He was the kind of person who makes you aware of the weight of decisions, what to do with what you find. There were rules, formal ones, and then there were those that exist in a soldier's silence. Some among us insisted the boy be taken to the rear, handed over to intelligence, booked as a prisoner. Others said there might be value in letting him go, in bagging little secrets like his billet or unit strength. And a few, with the look of men who had seen too much, muttered that we should leave him to the elements. The war would sort him out, they said. Officers in warm command posts never had to make these tiny moral calculations in the cold. I can't say now whether I thought clearly. Part of me moved first, muscle memory from a life of small kindnesses before the war that had nothing to do with strategy. I remember the smell, smoke from a cigarette one of the men had lit, the metallic odor of fuel, and under it all, the child's breath. I remember the sound of the boy's teeth chattering. It was one of those moments when the world of obligations presses in on you from all directions, and you have to pick a side. "He's just a kid," I heard myself say, and the words felt ugly and clumsy out of my mouth, as if they didn't do justice to what they were trying to carry. One of the men laughed once, a short, hollow sound that was part bitterness, part disbelief. "We're at war," he said. "You don't rescue the enemy." It was said like a law, like a rule carved in iron. I looked at him. He looked no older than my youngest brother had been when he ran down to the corner store for candy. He had a child's scab on one knuckle and a missing button on his coat. In the stack of jerry cans, somebody had carved initials with a pocket knife. The world kept making these small, obscene contradictions, the luxury of fuel and the poverty of human care. The lieutenant barked an order. "Secure the area. 2 men with me. 1 stays with the boy." He pointed, and I stepped forward. The man who had been beside me gave a quick nod. There was something like relief in his eyes when the assignment fell to me. I knelt and took the boy's hand. It was warm under the glove and shockingly small. He flinched at the touch at first, then relaxed as if touching something familiar. "Easy," I said, and my voice surprised me by coming out steady. He answered in staccato German, but I caught one word: "Leer," empty.
He was saying empty, or perhaps pointing to the emptiness he felt in the world. I couldn't tell if he meant the tank gauges or his own stomach. We didn't have much to give. A man offered half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. I tore it in two and gave him the smaller half. He ate like a starved child, hungrily, with a greed that wasn't prideful but necessary. I tried to bandage his temple as best I could with a strip torn from my scarf. The cloth smelled of tobacco and sweat. When I pressed it to his skin, he winced but didn't pull away. The lieutenant returned, and with him came the official language of war. Take him in for interrogation, find out where he was from, if he had information. Orders pointed at the practicality of being useful. But there was also a phrase I remember him mumbling under his breath, as if he were confessing to himself. We don't have the time to make exceptions. He meant the war had already decided that there was no room for private mercy, and yet there I was, kneeling in the snow, feeling like mercy was the only thing left that made any sense. The boy spoke again, and this time I caught that his words were more of a stutter than anything. He was frightened mostly of movement, of being seen, of being marked, of being taken. He nodded when I gestured toward a shallow depression in the ground, where a matted storm of canvas and a broken crate made a crude shelter. In there, I said, and he shrugged and crawled under with the animal haste of someone who had learned to hide before they learned to run. That small act, of giving up a spot that could have been used for resting men or storing rations, felt monumental.
It was a decision that had no metric for commanders. It mattered to me because of the child's face in the snow, because of the hand that fit into mine like a cheaper glove. And I think even then, I understood something the generals would not say aloud. The war is decided in factories and rail yards, by numbers and tonnage, but it is lived and remembered by singular acts. We stayed near the pile of cans while the others sorted. Men joked nervously, trying to break the pressure. A corporal found a battered photograph in a wallet, the edges curled and the image faded. A woman at a fair smiling with a scarf around her head. He hung it up on a stake like a talisman. Another man took out a small radio and turned the dial. For a moment we were given the thin comfort of music, a song that belonged at a dance, not in a foxhole. The normal things of civilization kept appearing in the strangest places, as if they'd been misplaced and then found when someone needed them most. The atmosphere was brittle. The knowledge that this dump could mean movement for one side and catastrophe for another hung between us like a cold mist. Conversation circled back to logistics, the Red Ball Express keeping roads moving, the pipelines men had laid across miles, the factories back home spitting out more than the enemy could match. We traded statistics in the way soldiers do with facts, a shorthand to make sense of danger. They've got so much fuel, someone said. We move on their oil and on our engines. That sentence, simple as it was, explained why we were both elated and anxious. Fuel was the blood of armies. I thought about the boy under the tarp. I thought about other boys, the ones in mud bunker trenches, the ones whose names we would never know. I thought about the calculus that had led generals to order that dumps be burned when they couldn't be guarded. To deny the enemy was to win the larger part of the fight. Yet here we were, with the enemy in our sight, and all our rules seemed to be made of thin paper compared to the stubborn reality of a human face. Orders came down, crisp as frost. We were to hold position until nightfall, then move back along the road toward a more defensible line. There was a plan to catalog what we'd taken, to load what could be used, to destroy the rest. A sapper and an engineer would be assigned to handle demolition. I knew what demolition meant. The slow, careful placement of charges, the thoughtless dot of a match in a heap of fuel, the bird's eye view of a policy that could be implemented with the pull of a lever. It also meant that what we had just found might be turned into a spectacle of flame before the Germans ever touched it. That prospect made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had seen supply dumps burned before, the smoke climbing into the sky like a column that could be read as victory and as waste. I had smelled the thick, acrid cloud of burning fuel, and I had seen men stand and watch their future flare and die. There was a cruelty to it, not always a cruelty of intent, but of necessity. And necessity in war has a way of muting the finer human noises. Word moved around the stacks. The engineer had arrived. He was a steady man with gloved fingers and a primer in his pocket. He checked the cans, jotted notes, and relayed a terse list back to command. They wanted to deny anything that couldn't be safely moved. It felt like an equation being solved on paper, and we were the small ink smudges that made sense of it. I found myself moving toward the boy again, as if pulled by some thread. He sat up when he heard me, blinking against the sun. His eyes, up close, were the color of cold water.
He looked younger than I'd realized. He tried to say something, and I took off my glove and cupped his cheek with a slow hand like I was handling porcelain. He flinched, then stayed. "We'll get you looked at," I said, and the sentence felt both promise and lie. The truth was, our medics were stretched thin, and there were more wounded than bandages. But there is a kind of currency in making a promise in war. Even a small one can buy a man's courage. "Name?" I asked, and his mouth worked around a name that didn't travel through my lips. I didn't catch it. Languages are like knives in the dark. They can slice meaning out of a moment or leave you blind. He shrugged, or perhaps he didn't understand the question. He handed me a small, dirt-smudged object, a charm, maybe, carved from wood. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it, trusting me with an item that belonged to his private life. We had both been given something without invitation, responsibility. I had the weight of a decision about whether to hide him, to hand him in, to pretend I hadn't seen. He had the burden of being seen and the fragile hope that seeing could mean mercy. Footsteps came then, heavier than before, and a voice called my name. The lieutenant wanted to move. The engineers' detachment had placed charges along the line of cans deemed untransportable. Men began dragging the rest into the trucks. I felt the moment narrow, as if fate were sharpening to a single point. The boy looked at me then, and something in his expression, fear, trust, and a kind of pleading, cut through the noise. "Stay here," I said, clumsier than I'd intended, knowing the order might not hold. He nodded, muffling a sound into his scarf. I gave him a last look, and then turned away, pretending to help load a jerry can onto a flatbed. My hands were steady when I lifted and passed the can, but my heart pounded like a trapped bird. The explosions were planned to come after loading. The engineer had a look in his eyes that spoke of assignments completed and things done because they had to be. We were told to be at least 300 yards away when it happened.
That was a practical number, not a moral one. We positioned ourselves along the road, shivering in our coats, watching the smoke curl and the men move with the efficiency of those who have rehearsed this choreography many times. I kept glancing back toward the tarp, where the boy lay curled, but he was hidden from sight. The sky was a hard white. The sun, where it managed to show, made the metallic cans gleam like scales. For a moment, the world looked absurdly small and sharp and ridiculous. Men in uniforms, moving metal like insects tending some collective nest. I fought the urge to walk back, to grab the boy and run into the trees until the war lost interest in us both. But there are distances a man can move and distances he cannot. The map of a soldier's courage is drawn in those lines. The charges began to hiss. It was sound like a kettle about to boil, as if the air itself anticipated flame. We watched, a ring of men around a thing that was to be made into a spectacle. The first spark caught a rag, stuffed into a seam, and then flame ran like a tongue along a trail. The jerry cans caught quickly, a bright, terrible bloom that threw heat and light and the smell of burnt rubber and metal. And then, at the last instant, like a wrinkle in a film reel, a small figure burst from the heap where we had hidden the young soldier. He ran, his boots slipping on the frozen ground, his jacket flapping like a child's cape. He had either been frightened by something, or he had been trying to recover a photograph, or he had simply decided that not dying alone was better than the safety of hiding. He didn't come toward us. He ran toward the tree line, toward a place that might mean nothing and might mean everything. Safety, or another trap. "Stop him!" someone shouted. The shout was not sharp enough. Men jumped up and began to chase, boots thundering. I was in motion before I knew I had moved, my body remembering paths my mind hadn't authorized. The world tilted. Someone cursed, a rifle crack, and a sound like a body hitting the snow. I don't know whether the round meant to stop a man or to scare, but the boy stumbled and fell hard, sliding on ice. He hit the ground with his face into the snow, and for a breathless second, the entire field of action froze around the small, private catastrophe of that fall. I went for him. You ask a man of 94 why he did something in the fog of youth and near forgetting, and you'll get many answers that sound like excuses. Here's the only clean one I have. I couldn't leave him. Not because I loved the enemy, not because I had some romantic thought about reconciliation, but because the sight of a boy smeared into the white with a smear of blood on his temple made all our orders and logistics and grand strategies look like a child's arithmetic. A life is a life. It was as simple and as damning as that. I reached him in 2 strides.
He didn't flinch this time.
His eyes opened and found mine with the clarity of someone who had expected being left and had found instead the opposite. His lips shaped a question, but nothing came out. I scooped him up without thinking of how absurdly light he was and how much lighter I felt for holding him. There was a shout behind me, a pistol fired into the air, a man's voice cursing. I wrapped my arms around the boy and cradled him to my chest as if I could make him a small, warm island in a sea of cold orders. We tore back toward the flatbed and the tarpaulin, where men were scrambling to move the remaining cans. The engineer's face had hardened into something like thunder. I could see him calculating a new sequence for the blast, for a world in which men could still be seen to be practical. "Drop him," he barked at me, concrete and precise. "You can't bring prisoners into the blast zone. You'll have to leave him." I held him closer. He smelled like snow and fear and the faint stench of fuel. His cheek rested against my chin, and his breath was a little ragged against my neck. The man behind me made a move, a hand toward my shoulder, a half-grab meant to turn me. I dug my heels into the frozen ground like a man trying to punch a hole in winter. I understood then how those who refused orders felt. Not righteous, not brave, simply weighted by a decision they were not willing to absolve themselves of. "Take him with us," I said. My voice was small but steady. "We can't leave him." It was both plea and order. I said it because the boy's face had become a proof I could not ignore. They were shouting. Horses? No. Engines. The flatbed began to roll, with men and things and the engineer signaling the rest to move back. Someone slapped me on the shoulder hard, a roughness that might have been punishment, or might have been an offer of solidarity. The lieutenant's jaw clenched, but there was a flicker, and then he nodded. Perhaps because the chain of command is sometimes flexible, when behind it stand men who will not let go. Or perhaps he nodded because he couldn't carry the sight of the boy in the snow past him. I held him and walked. We stepped away from the pile as charges counted down. The smoke rose. A man nearest us turned toward the flash, and the heat rolled over us in a wall. For a second the light turned everything into silhouettes. Men, stacks, the trees. And then the sound came, a low, swallowing boom that pushed snow from the ground and made the air taste of metal. Against that monstrous sound, the boy's small cough seemed absurdly fragile. We moved into the trees, into a place where the world muffled itself. Snowflakes landed on the boy's hair and melted into dark spots. He was quiet for a long time, dreaming perhaps, or stunned, or maybe just too exhausted to speak. My hands, which had been steady for a lifetime, trembled slightly from the exertion. There was a warmth where he pressed against me that meant nothing to strategy, and everything to being human. When we stopped, I sat him down against a fallen log and tried to make a bed out of my cloak. He looked up at me and smiled for the first time. A small, thin thing, like the first light at dawn. "Danke," he said. Maybe it was out of habit to say something polite. Maybe it was genuine thanks. I don't know. It's the last coherent sound before a memory starts to blur, and memories are treacherous things. They give you what they like and take away what they don't. We were a small knot of men around a fire that someone had scraped together with borrowed logs. The conversation around us was low, practical. Where to move next, the state of the roads, whether to push for the ridge before snow made movement impossible. Logistics again, whether the tanks had been refueled sufficiently, whether the engineers could bridge a culvert, whether supplies from the Red Ball Express might arrive in time. Those were the things the Army lived by. They were the bigger picture that swallowed countless small acts like the one I had just done. But in my chest, the act felt enormous. It wasn't a triumph. There was no glory in it. There was only the thick, stubborn fact that I had held a boy who might have been somebody's son. The moral arithmetic of that night wasn't elegant. It was messy as the muddy road, and it left stains that don't wipe clean. We kept watch in shifts. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the spark of the explosion, the heat of the flames, and the small body against me. Night in the Ardennes had a sound all its own. Distant engines, an occasional crack that might be a branch or might be a man falling, the whisper of frost shifting. The boy slept a little, then woke with a start, and when he did, I gave him what I had left to give,
a tin of caramelized fruit someone had found, a sliver of a chocolate bar, my scarf pulled tight around his neck. The next morning, we'd have decisions to make about prisoners and quartering and movement. There would be papers and forms and a bureaucracy that eats compassion with the same quiet efficiency it uses to track tonnage. I thought of the engineer's face when he'd seen me carry the boy away. I thought of those who would see the decision as foolish or even dangerous. I knew the world wouldn't stop for what I had done. The war would still be decided by pipelines and factories, by convoys and railheads. But somewhere in the map of the conflict, a tiny square had been shaded differently because of that one small choice. We moved out before dawn. The road was a shallow scar through the forest. Men shifted in their saddles, adjusting straps and boots. The boy walked beside me as if he had long experience moving with soldiers. His gait was unsteady but determined. He clung to the little charm in his fist, and now and then he looked up at me, eyes that had seen too much and yet still held a fragile curiosity. If I'd been asked then what I thought would come of this, I would have had no answer.
I thought only of the immediate, the next mile, the next ditch, the next village, where maybe there would be shelter and a medic and a place to hand him over to someone who would have seen more of the rules than I had. I was aware of the absurdity of the situation, a soldier carrying an enemy boy who might be a source of intelligence, an object of suspicion, an act of humanity, or a problem that would complicate the chain of command. We moved through small hamlets where windows were shuttered and dogs barked behind frosted panes. Children would peep and then disappear when they saw the uniforms. Their parents kept them close. We passed an abandoned farmhouse where a woman had left a loaf on the table and a note pinned to the door. Those glimpses of ordinary life, scattered like coins on the road of war, felt like evidence that the world refused to be entirely consumed by strategy. At one point, as we skirted the edge of a field, the boy stopped and pointed at a line of abandoned vehicles half sunk into snow. There were tanks there, once proud, now with doors open and mud hardened like crust. Their gauges read flat. A few had left the keys and not the chance. A corporal muttered that they'd been cut off from fuel and had no choice but to bail. Men climbed on hulks and picked at radios and empty mittens and the odd photograph wedged under a dashboard. The sight of those wasted machines gave the lie to any romantic notion of war being a contest of skill alone. The supply chain had become an equal player, sometimes the deciding one. "We could have used one of those last week," my companion said softly. It's strange how even in such moments soldiers speak like accountants. They note loss in terms of utility. But then so could they. We had a lull, an hour of walking that felt like time set aside for thinking. The boy matched his stride to mine, as if he were learning the rhythm of our unit. He let me look at the scrap of paper he had tucked inside his coat. A name, scribbled in a hand that had the quickness of youth. I traced it with a finger and tried to say it aloud. I'm ashamed to say I couldn't. It was foreign to my tongue. The boy tapped his chest at the name and smiled, and it was then I saw his family in a way that reports and numbers never show. Not an abstraction, but a knot of people with a laundry list of habits and nicknames and arguments. You can read pages upon pages about theaters of war, and it will tell you where armies held ground and where they didn't. But it won't always tell you why a man would pick up a child and carry him when doing so might cost him a position or a life. It won't tell you how the heat of an explosion feels in the gut a long time later. Those things get left out of official histories because they fit awkwardly alongside tonnage and strategy, yet they are the reason knights are restless decades later. We reached a crossroads where a signpost still wobbled, its arrows pointing like fingers in different directions. A liaison officer met us there, a man with a furrowed face who smelled of pipe tobacco and was quick with paperwork. He looked at the boy and then at me, and for a long moment nothing moved but the air. He asked questions in a paper voice that wanted to make a record: name, rank, unit, reason for presence. I answered as best I could, shrugging over words that had become worn and thin from repetition. "Take him to the temporary holding area," the liaison instructed, and then in a tone meant to soften the order, "We'll pass him along to proper authorities." I handed the boy over and watched as they led him toward a building that had been hastily converted into a processing center. Men in neutral patches, the ones who do the paperwork of war, took down his name with a pen that scratched like a fingernail across a surface. For a moment I thought they would offer a blanket, a cup of hot broth, a place to sit. They did. They did all of those things.
They also asked the boy questions in a voice that was precise and efficient, the voice of a machine designed to parse people into categories. I left him there, with men who did the official work of war, and a part of me went with him like a shadow. The world moved on. Our column turned its wheels and plodded away toward the next objective. Behind us, the field we had left glowed faint with the memory of the burned dump. The smoke had thinned into a gray veil, but was still rising, as if the land could not let go of what had been consumed. For days afterward, small details returned to me unbidden. The sound of the boy coughing in the night, the way his hands had clung to the charm, the taste of the salted biscuit we shared. I thought about the engineer's look when he realized I'd saved him. I thought about the lieutenant's tightly folded face, and about the man who had laughed when I said the boy was just a kid. Those faces looped through my head like a litany of ordinary witnesses to an act that might be praised or condemned depending on the account. There are stories that end with tidy moral arcs, and there are the ones that refuse neatness. Mine did not finish in the field. The boy's fate, what they did with him after we left, remained a detail my memory refused to hand over cleanly. I do remember, though, the day months later when I stood by a gutted tank in a small museum near the city, and kids ran their fingers along canvas and rust and asked their fathers what a war had been like. I put my hand on the cold metal and thought of distances, the miles a can of fuel could carry an army, and the inches between a man's hand and a child's crumpled body. Looking back across the decades, I see a map with two layers. One is the big topography of conflict, factories running at capacity, pipelines humming, convoys that kept soldiers had enough to keep moving.
The other is a minefield of small choices, the private acts that don't change the course of a campaign, but do alter the course of a life. The engineers and generals argue about tonnage and routes. They are right in a way. Wars do lean on supply like a house leans on beams. But among the beams and the cracks and hidden corners, men pick up other men. And those are the moments that shape who we are when the uniforms come off. I don't know how many times over the years I have replayed the exact moment. The scrape of snow when he hit the ground, the small sound he made, the way his fingers clenched around that wooden charm. It comes back in fragments, a flash of white, the smell of burning rubber, the abrupt light of an explosion painting everything in silhouette. Sometimes it wakes me at night, and sometimes it visits me in the quiet of afternoons when the house is full of the small noises of ordinary life and someone is making tea in the kitchen. Memory is a funny thing. It refuses to tidy itself the way official histories do. It keeps the ugly, the tender, and the inconvenient parts together. After the war, I tried to find him. I sent inquiries to the Red Cross. I asked interrogators and clerks when my unit rotated through processing centers. There are records, of course, but records in the wake of a continent turned inside out are a messy, incomplete thing. Men moved, units disintegrated and reassembled under new names. Children who had been soldiers were folded into displaced person registries, where they vanished into towns where nobody asked about their past. I never found a neat line that led to his name. Sometimes I tell myself that was luck for him. Other times I tell myself it was a failing on my part, that I didn't push harder, that I didn't know enough about the bureaucracy to force an answer. Years later, I returned to the Ardennes, older now, and smaller in some ways, because the war had whittled down what I imagined myself to be. The place where we detonated the depot was a field people now walked with dogs and children. There was a plaque near a small museum, and inside were helmets and a map and a shell of a tank, its metal eaten by time. I ran my hand along the cold steel and felt the ghost of the heat we had once stood beside. A local man who had been a boy that winter told me what he'd heard from his father, that supply dumps like that one had been lifelines, and that when they burned, they left a smell in the valley for months. He did not know the boy I had carried. He couldn't help me. Still, standing there, with the tourists and school children around, I understood that the memory of what we do in war is not simply the sum of tactics and logistics. It lives too in small, private acts that leave no marker on the map.
That day in the trees,
when I scooped him into my arms and walked away while charges still counted down, is the act I return to when I try to measure who I was then and who I am now. It does not erase the larger truths: logistical power, factories, pipelines, convoys. It decided so much. If you want to know why the Germans stalled in that offensive, you have to look at fuel. You have to look at the way the Allies kept roads moving with truck drivers on the Red Ball Express, how pipelines and stockpiles kept tanks supplied, and how the Axis couldn't match that inflow. The front lines were drawn as much by rails and refineries as by any single general's plan. On one side, there was a steady river of gasoline and replacement parts. On the other, scarcity that turned units into scavengers overnight. That reality makes strategic sense of abandoned tanks, of crews walking away from hulks because gauges read empty and the next ration truck was nowhere in sight. But even acknowledging that, I keep returning to a smaller ledger. A life saved is not the same as a supply captured. The two operate on different scales and by different languages. The generals and engineers will talk about tonnage, and tonnage will tell them whether to advance or fall back. But the man who picks up a boy and gives him a billet under a blanket does not make those calculations. He acts on a different currency, the immediate human need. I have thought about how abundance looked to the men who had the misfortune to be on the other side of it. I can still picture the expression in soldiers' faces when they saw American newspapers and the stacks of jerry cans, the confusion, the bitter disbelief, the humiliation. That sight did something to morale. I remember one of our lads picking up a cigarette pack like it was a relic, and another pressing his face into a pile of clothing and laughing like a man who has found a talisman. For the Germans who watched such scenes, if they were near enough to see, it was evidence of an enemy that could keep going because of its resources. Despair is a terrible ally of rage. We heard later about events like Malmedy and about the way atrocities hardened men on both sides. News like that, when it arrives, makes men less inclined to see the enemy as anything but the enemy. It complicates mercy. I do not excuse those who committed war crimes. I only note that a hardening took place, and in that hardness, simple acts of compassion were fought over in the chest as bitterly as any hill. I do not pretend my choice to carry that boy was economically rational or strategically helpful. It was, in the calculus of war, negligible. We did not change the flow of fuel across Europe because of that one decision, but it mattered. To me, to the boy in my arms, and perhaps in some ripple I cannot know, to the shape of some life that followed. Weeks and months and years after, I would sometimes think about what an ordinary life that boy might have had if we'd never met. A job, a family, a name that appears in a ledger somewhere, or a grave in a cemetery I never visited. The thought of the what-ifs sits with me, not as triumph, but as a plea. Remember these small chances we take with humanity. There is another thing I want to say about memory and responsibility. When you get to be old, people ask you for stories, and you find yourself telling the same ones because they are the ones that held when the years piled up. But memory can be treacherous. It will fill in details where none existed. It will protect you from blame and then later hand it back to you. I have been careful in telling this to younger people and to historians alike. I do not want my anecdote to be used as a neat moral proof that there is always room for mercy in war. There are times when difficult choices must be made. The men who ordered us to deny supplies were not monsters for thinking about the bigger picture. They were trying to win a war that had to be won to end other evils. My point is smaller and less satisfying. Even in those decisions, there are moments when an individual can choose differently, and those choices are part of our human accounting. Over the years, I have met veterans on both sides, men who fought for the Allies and men who fought for Germany. Many of them carried similar burdens. At memorials and in veterans associations, we've exchanged stories and sometimes nodded to each other's pain, like old soldiers acknowledging shared weather. There were times in those conversations when a German veteran, with a face lined like a plowed field, would look at me and say, in halting English, "We were boys. We were moved like pieces.
There is a terrible truth in that sentence. Armies move children sometimes, and children do not always return to their childhoods. None of that excuses policy or atrocity, but it does show how messy human motives are inside a machine made of iron and expense reports. People ask me if what I did made me feel different about the war or about the cause we fought for. The honest answer is yes and no. I was proud, then and now, to have fought against a regime whose crimes are beyond dispute. But pride is not a balm for all the small things that war takes. My act of carrying that boy did not reduce my sense of the necessity of defeating tyranny. If anything, it complicated it. It reminded me that even when we are right, we carry with us the weight of those we could not save, and the responsibility to act humanely when possible. As the years passed, the world changed the way it calculates warfare. Machines got more complex, supply chains more elaborate, and the idea that logistics win wars did not go away. If anything, it became sharper, but the human piece has persisted.
In training halls and parades, in the classrooms where history is taught, we sometimes forget that wars are not only decided by railheads and refineries, they are also decided by the small acts of people who, in moments of choice, choose to treat another person as a person. I have kept the charm he gave me all these years. It sits in a wooden box with a photograph of my platoon and a letter from a cousin who never returned from the Pacific. The charm is small and worn, the grain of the wood polished by fingers that are long gone. Sometimes I hold it and imagine the boy's hands pressing it to my palm. I don't know what that object has meant to him, if he kept another copy or if he left it behind in the panic of those days. But for me, it has been a lodestar, a small, stubborn reminder that even when history lays down reasons for cruelty, individual hands can still pull another human out of the snow. At 94, I do talk to people about what these stories mean. I have stood in classrooms and in civic centers and in front of television cameras, telling this modest, messy tale. Young people often ask the same question with different phrasing. What would you tell us to do if we were faced with that choice? I tell them the only thing I can, that moral courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. I tell them that systems make decisions for millions, and that it's all the more important for individuals to hold to their small human laws. I tell them that the memory of those laws, when practiced, can be the thing that keeps a society humane. In the end, if there is a lesson that gathers up the tangled threads of that winter, it is this. Wars are organized industrial events, and much of the fighting is about supplies and capacity. Tanks stop because fuel stops. Columns halt because tires fail or bridges collapse. The maps generals pore over are as much maps of rail lines and pipe routes as they are maps of hills and rivers. But at the edges of those maps, where men and women meet and make instant, terrible choices, compassion can persist. Those choices don't always change campaigns. They don't always make the news. They might not be the thing remembered in textbooks, but they are the things remembered in quiet rooms when old men look at metal and bone and wonder whether the world has been made better. I do not pretend my act made the war kinder, or even that it made one life definitively saved for the future I imagined. I only know what I felt then, and what I feel now when the memory comes, that one small mercy mattered, at least to me, and I hope to the boy I carried. We carry the sum of our tiny mercies and our failures, and in that carrying, we are what we become. If this story matters to you, please consider sharing it. These are the kinds of memories that slip away if no one listens.
There are thousands of veterans with pieces of the same fabric, some frayed, some intact, and preserving those stories is part of our duty to history and to one another. Thank you for hearing mine.